I like it. It's the type of area that really gets it gets me thinking. I find it quite inspirational when you're looking at these challenges. Partly because I'm from I've got an entrepreneurial type mindset,
Yeah.
so I look at that and I go, oh, I like that. That's
Yeah.
interesting. You can really get your teeth into that. So another thing I'm keen for us to get our teeth into a little bit is kind of following on from a conversation that we had at the eWorld conference recently, where I was talking about the kind of data gap in services procurement and where it is, possibly left behind in some ways compared to other areas when it comes to digital transformation. And we were just talking about whether or not the buying and contracting of services is a messy thing. With our kind of from the brief conversation we had at the time, it being kind of like, well, you know what, it is pretty messy, and that was something that I thought would really be interesting to just discuss in a little bit more detail. So, obviously, you've worked in kind of like heavy manufacturing industries, but you've also worked in extremely services-led industries like banking. What's your opinion on that in terms of whether it is a messy thing, and if so, what that looks like?
Yeah. As a blanket statement, I'll generally say yes, services can be messy. I think as a starting point.
Yeah.
And it's of course there are better practices and worse practices, but generally it's a messy space. But I will also say that spend is generally messy,
right,
in big organisations. So if you're looking at goods and services, you normally, if you're in a complex business or complex organisation, you're dealing with multiple business units, multiple jurisdictions, all buying in different ways. And so therein lies the challenge in its own right, that you're trying to aggregate and centralise a lot of that way of thinking, as in many cases. So therefore, starting point is pretty messy.
It's complicated.
It's
messy.
complicated. Yeah. And then if you kind of drill down into that more, I think what do services really mean for a business? So you mentioned the manufacturing side of things. In reality, services, we probably looked at it at the time, very much through the directs and indirects lens. And directs was this was back in my day at Tarmac, which was part of the Anglo-American group at the time. And direct materials were typically, bitumen and trying to get raw materials into the supply chain. And the indirect side of things, we're pushing everything else up to that direct space, which could have been maintenance services. It could be anything to do with kind of construction and manufacturing, where you're using labour of sorts in that supply chain. So dependent on what your definition of services is for your business, that's also going to determine how complex and how messy things are. And you talked about, on the bank, if I look at the other extreme in the banking side of things, most of the business model of banking is services driven, if you think about that, and therefore services can sometimes traverse into the direct side of things.
That's what I was going to say. I mean, Naveen Amin was talking about this with regards to engineering consultancy. So basically, they're providing services to their own customer, if their own customer's HS2, for example, but they've got a surveying firm. They're acting as an extended part of their organisation that are actually providing those services. So those services are direct, and actually their indirect is buying goods like laptops, for example. So that's where the definitions are always really important in any industry. But again, in procurement, because I feel it's quite an evolving space, and there's so much complexity to it, because it's got to cover everything. I feel like the definitions, sometimes it's harder to have those as being something it's never going to be uniform across sectors, industries, locations, different types of organisation, because people are buying different things, they're buying them differently, they're either offering a product or a service to the market in so many different ways. It's incredibly diverse in that point of view as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that you cannot have a uniform definition of services. It's possibly unique to the industry that you're in, or it's possibly unique to the relative company you're in. I think as a professional, who, if you're trying to cut through what's services and what's not services, you've just got to recognise what your business model is really entailing. So if you are a bank, or if you're a services-based company, maybe even a large consultancy, for example, and services are far more at the front of what you do, you need to know where you're drawing the line on services compared to consumables or anything else that you're going through. So I think just having the mindset of knowing what services is is an important thing. But back to your point around complexity. Yes, I think there is complexity, and I think that the complexity is driven mainly by humans.